From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. With me today is Ambassador Nabil Fahmy. Ambassador Fahmy has a long and illustrious career in the Egyptian Foreign Service. He is currently the Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University of Cairo. He is a former Foreign Minister of Egypt and served for many years as Egypt's ambassador in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Fahmy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm happy to be here.
Ambassador Fahmy was in town for a joint workshop that the Middle East Institute and the Institute at the American University of Cairo held in Washington, D.C., working on Egyptian-U.S. relations. Ambassador Fahmy, let me start with the Egyptian news of the week. This was a week of elections in Egypt. Maybe not very suspenseful elections in terms of their outcome, covered in the U.S. with, I would say, maybe some criticism, to put it mildly, not much competition and so on. You're coming from Cairo. What is the mood in Cairo? What is the political meaning of this election or referendum, if you want to call it, the positive and the negative?
Two things. The mood in Cairo is we want to move from a situation of transition and putting things together to a situation where we're actually reaping the benefits of some difficult decisions over the last 4 years and definitely over the last 7. The elections were simply a step in this process. Everybody expected the president to get reelected. The candidate running against him submitted his candidature very, very late in the process and frankly does not have the ground support that the president has. So they're looking forward. We should have a new government very, very soon. And then the important thing will be how the president projects his ambitions in the next 4 years and how the government lays out their program for action. That will involve foreign policy as well as domestic steps.
A lot of people would think that the President Sisi is fairly popular and would have won a competitive election. There's no other real figures currently that would effectively compete with him. Why do you think the sort of political space was restricted to this degree? Did he fear instability or did the state fear instability? What's the reasoning behind it, do you think?
First of all, I share the point you just made. I think the president would have won under any circumstances. In other words, even against strong competition, he still would have won. He has a majority support on the street, and there are no strong parties with grassroots, foundation to really run a strong national campaign, which is different from municipalities and the sort. Why is a good question. Probably it's a function of these have been 7 years of 2 revolutions, violence on the street, an economy that was growing at zero at one point, very pressing demands from the people. We have problems of terrorism, especially in the northern central Sinai area. The president came into office first time after being Minister of Defense, responsible to deal with these security problems. So I suppose there still is culturally an institution of
kind of a security first.
We're in a battle situation. So let's get over this step first and then move forward. I think, frankly, to achieve our full potential, we need to grow politically as well. Economically, socially, but politically as well.
You're at the university, at the American University of Cairo. Young people, obviously. The young people were a big part of the revolution of 2011 and maybe even the second revolution, as they say, a couple of years later. What's the mood today among your students or among, the Egyptian young? I know it's a big community, but give us some insights to how the younger generation is experiencing things today.
It's a great question, really. Young people are always in a hurry and want to see immediate results. They also have idealistic dreams, legitimate ones. I'm not in any way diminishing those dreams, but not that much experience in how to get there. So what you see in Egypt today is a significant amount of youth who are still dreaming about the 2011 revolution and the expectations, which were all sincere, maybe a bit too exaggerated in the short term, but they were all sincere. Some of them are disappointed that we haven't reached that level. Others, having gone through 2 revolutions and the Muslim Brotherhood year in office, feel we've had enough revolutions and I just want to start my employment career and a new period in life. So they're a bit split in that respect. I would argue that of these 2, neither of them is really satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
The highly educated youth are doing well.
Mm-hmm.
The average educated youth has a problem. Are not.
Yeah, and that's partly because of the challenges in the economy.
And then, to be fair
creation.
to the present government, the president has had the courage to take very difficult decisions, like fluctuating the currency, like reducing subsidies.
Well, let's talk about the economy. I mean, some people say maybe the most successful file, I mean, nothing's perfect, is in the economic field. What would you summarize as the scorecard economically for the president in his first term?
I'd argue, given the challenges he had, that I'd give him economically 65 to 70% at least.
Mm-hmm.
He's had 90% courage of decision making, but you need to deal with the structural problems as well as take the decisions. In other words, fluctuating the currency was not easy. Removing subsidies was not easy. There's an immediate negative effect with the middle class and the lower middle class. At the same time, to solve those economic problems and create investment opportunities, you need to deal with the structural problems, and that takes a bit longer of time. So I think economically per se, as difficult as things are, he's on the right track.
And would you say, I mean, maybe the mood among either business people or young people who are maybe young entrepreneurs, economically, has Egypt begun to turn the corner, or it's still approaching the corner? Is growth, I mean, are people feeling it? I mean, people are feeling a lot of pain. There's inflation. There's the pressures of restructuring. Are they seeing some of the fruits yet?
We're growing now at about 4.8, 5.1%. For a developing country like Egypt, especially after several years of no growth, that's not enough. But it's definitely much more than we were doing 2 or 3 years ago.
Better than 1%.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So is it enough? No. Therefore, my direct answer to your question, are people feeling it enough? No. But even when taking these decisions, to be fair to the president, he said you won't feel it in 2 years. So let's see over the next, not 4 years, over the next 1.5 to 2 years.
Well, let me ask you a difficult question that relates to that. President Sisi is entering his second term as president. The current constitution says there's a 2-term limit. These developments, as you say, take time to mature and develop. The president himself has said, and you said, the opposition parties, well, let's just call them the parties, maybe they're opposition or not, are not really developed and ready to take maybe the reins of political power. As the president enters his second term and people want to know what's going to happen afterward, what are people in Egypt imagining? Is it the president will remain president for more than the second term? Does the military have any other options? How do Egyptians see their own future?
Well, great question. First of all, the president himself has said he'd only stay 2 terms. If he acts on that in the short term, again, during the first year or 1.5 to help create wider space for parties, help potentially emerging candidates come up, then frankly, people will look at the end of his 4th term very optimistically. If we go through 2 or 3 years without any progress in that respect, then they're going to be faced with the situation of having to elect the president for a 3rd time and to change the constitution to do that, or take a bad candidate for president. And neither of those 2 options are what was promised for the time being. So let's wait and see on that. It's a challenge. I mean, that's why I said,
indeed,
to reach the full potential, we need to move not only on economics and security, but also on the political side.
You're here in Washington with a group from AUC. You were ambassador here. You were foreign minister. Obviously, the focus on your visit was on U.S.-Egyptian relationships. The relationship was fairly difficult, I would say, during the turbulent years in Egypt over the past few years, and under the Obama administration. There was much hope with President Trump that the relationship would greatly improve, and yet there's still some hiccups. How would you describe the current condition of U.S.-Egyptian relations?
Unsatisfactory. I think that what both sides expected was much more than what they actually dealt with, because they did not understand each other well enough. And we need to redress that. It is not acceptable that since 1974 until now we've had diplomatic relations, generally good, much more than bad, and nevertheless we still don't understand each other properly. Election of an American president is a very important step, and it does affect policy. But there are many stakeholders in the American system that also affect policy, less than the president, but they affect policy. Same thing happens in Egypt. Simply because you happen to agree with the president in office doesn't mean that you can ignore the aspirations in the street, because neither the American president nor the Egyptian president can ignore his own domestic constituency.
Definitely.
So I'm not satisfied with the relationship because I know we can both do much better.
Some people say sort of the relationship, here we are in 2018, much of the relationship is based on the 1970s, the Camp David Agreement between Egypt and Israel, based on which there is U.S. assistance to Egypt and so on. That was many decades ago, and we are in a new century and a new era with new challenges for Egypt and certainly for the United States. U.S. perhaps looking to Asia, no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil. The Israeli issue is no longer the central issue, Iran and terrorism. What would you say were the common interests between Egypt and the U.S. for this decade or this century, if we forgot about the 70s in the history?
Dealing with extremism, be that violent or non-violent, preserving the nation-state system in the Middle East. I'm talking about common in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Because if you break down that system, you will end up with so many non-state party stakeholders, and you won't be able to manage your interests in that respect. Developing an economic perspective for youth. 56% of the Middle Easterners are younger than 25 years old, 35 younger than 35 years old. If they don't have a future, the Middle East will be angry, and that doesn't serve America or Egypt for that matter. Most of them live, a quarter of them actually live in Egypt. And then, of course, no region in the world can look forward to a future when you have 5 inflamed conflicts all at the same time, be that what's happening in Libya, what's happening in Syria, the whole issue of ISIL in the Mashriq, in the Levant, the situation in Yemen, the absence of an Arab-Israeli peace process. We need to start addressing those issues in the short term.
Well, let me ask you about, specifically on the ISIS in the Sinai, or the insurgency in the Sinai. Egypt, the oldest state in the world, biggest Arab army certainly. And 4 years since President Sisi took over, while there has been progress against these groups in Iraq and in Syria, even in tiny Lebanon, Egypt has not yet been able to defeat that group in northern Sinai. It's hard for many people from outside to understand that. What's gone right? What's gone wrong in that attempt?
Sure. 2 reasons for that. First of all, rather than decreasing, they actually increased with the pressure being put on them in Syria and Iraq.
Explain that.
Well, more of them left that area and looked into other areas, went to Libya,
I see what,
and came across the Egyptian border from Libya, which is no man's land. Secondly, more of the money and the focus and the arms that were going to the Levant came through towards Egypt. So that's an international problem. And we argued from day one, we need to go after ISIS in Syria and Iraq, but keep after them. Because if you don't keep after them, they're going to end up in some other form. And before ISIS, there was al-Qaeda. Before al-Qaeda, there were
and after ISIS, there will be something else,
others.
Probably.
That's one thing. The other point, frankly, is we made a mistake in Egypt for years. And I say this is far earlier than 2011 and the Arab Spring and all that. We did not focus enough on socioeconomic development in the Sinai. And therefore, the locals, and they are Egyptian, basically got their livelihood from illegitimate relations and activities, smuggling and across the border with occupied Palestine at the time, and then also from the western border all the way across Egypt there. So we are now trying to deal with a much more complicated problem. In the short term, there's no easy answer, because part of the response is military and security, but the resolution can only be also socioeconomic. And that takes a much longer
period of time to solve. Another issue that a lot of people have difficulty understanding, or maybe some agree, some disagree, the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood. Certainly an Islamist movement, political Islamist movement, was part of the political process under Mubarak and during the transition. President Morsi was elected. Certainly there was mismanagement and many issues. And currently banned, considered terrorist groups and so on. The question many people have is that, is this policy actually creating or like pushing young, particularly young Egyptians who may have supported the Muslim Brotherhood and whatnot, pushing them towards radicalization and making the problem worse, let alone the issues of legitimacy and things. How do you, as somebody who follows these things,
it's more complex than that. First of all, Anwar Sadat was the one who let the Brotherhood back into Egypt. Islamic extremism killed Anwar Sadat. So, again, he's the one who opened the door, but there were splinter groups who nevertheless attacked him. If you take that a bit...
How did President Mubarak deal with the same movement?
Mubarak initially started off focusing only on security. So while politically he didn't prevent them from continuing, in terms of on-the-ground security measures, he was rough.
Crackdown.
Real crackdown. I mean, he didn't change the laws to make them illegitimate, but they couldn't really move for a good 20 years of his 30 years in office. It's only towards the end, again, that he sort of opened it up a little bit. And his crackdown in the Sinai actually made the Sinai completely secure, although it didn't resolve the socioeconomic problems on the ground. So again, there's no easy answer to these things. The Muslim Brotherhood was actually invited back into government even after President Morsi was removed from office. Now, they didn't accept, and I suppose there's a certain logic to they were just thrown out, so maybe they didn't want to accept. But the problem, I mean, their party became illegitimate only because the violence continued on the street. And if you have to determine your priorities, you're going to deal with violence on the ground.
Security first.
Security first.
Yeah.
So it's I'm not a big fan of Islamists, frankly. I'm much more of a secularist and much more comfortable with inclusive politics. That being said, given the events we've gone through, this is going to take a long time to resolve.
Egypt was obviously the first country to sign peace with Israel back in 1978-79 and has always been a key player in attempts to resolve the Israel-Palestine issue. President Trump, through his son-in-law Jared Kushner, they seem to claim that they have some secret peace plan that they're going to unveil soon. Perhaps the Saudi Crown Prince has been in on some of the discussions. Has Egypt been part of this process? Do you have a view as to whether there still is a peace process?
Let me start with the end of that and then give you the answer to the question. I don't think there's a peace process. Not because of Trump, but because the present government in Israel does not believe in a two-state solution. So everything else is really
follows from that.
Academic.
Yeah.
Now, on the proposal and on the potential proposal, my understanding is that they have shared some ideas with different parties in the Middle East, including Egypt. I don't know what these ideas are. What I know about them is from public record rather than private record. And they're all about doing things differently, and there's no basis for it whatsoever to succeed.
Yeah, particularly after the decision on Jerusalem, you don't think there's anything...
I don't think, well, first of all...
operationable.
Again, I'll tell you what I think is in there rather than what I know, because I don't know what's in there. The idea that the problem is in the details, so postpone the details, is a non-starter. We've been doing this for 70 years, so it's not going to be resolved by postponing it further. Secondly, the idea of Palestinians postponing the resolution of this in exchange for economic incentives, we've gone beyond that phase. And thirdly, the idea that the Arabs can give up on Palestinian rights in exchange for more cooperation vis-a-vis Iran, be that from America or from Israel. More cooperation against Iran is merited. But Palestinian rights are Palestinian rights. And on the issue of Jerusalem, which you correctly mentioned, remember years back when I was here an ambassador here in America and talking with my Saudi counterpart, he told me that the Saudi king at the time, King Abdullah, had told President Arafat of Palestine that you can negotiate everything without getting back to us except Jerusalem. Because
that is the crown issue.
That's
definitely.
the crown issue, and we will not accept, just to give a carte blanche to that. This is important to all monotheistic religions, including Islam, but all religions. And by the way, in Egypt, we have 10% Christian. It's going to, and it's important to Jews as well. So it's going to be a complicated issue. To start off by saying, okay,
off the table,
yeah. Then frankly, there's no table to negotiate on.
Ambassador Fahmy, we're almost out of time. Let me ask you one last question. If there was one thing in Egyptian-U.S. relations in this coming year that you would like to see realistically move forward, what would it be?
I don't think 1 year is enough. I think there's potential to move forward, but I think we need to have intensive sub-secretary level discussions about the future. What should the region look like? What are each of our respective interests in real terms? That's really where I think we should start.
Sort of have a rich, multi-layered conversation.
It shouldn't be only among elected officials.
Not transactional,
It's more about the future and to recreate the trust factor that should be there after so many years of a strong relationship. Even when there was difficult problems, we still had a strong relationship. I would love to see more of a focus from the U.S. on youth, because that's really where the future is. And frankly, I hate to say this, but I would love to be proven wrong on the Arab-Israeli peace process and see something that really is supportive of a two-state solution. That would lead to a major change in how things are perceived. I expect the situation in Syria to be managed differently, not resolved, but managed differently. And as an Egyptian, I think American support for controlling the Libyan situation on the ground is very important.
I'm going to add a last question to my last question. This is more about Egypt. The human rights situation has remained pretty grim, and one can, you've explained, and perspective of the government and so on, is security first and so on. But it's really been quite a severe crackdown on all kinds of dissent and so on. To many in Egypt, and I would say certainly many in the West as well, that is, there's a clash of values there, but there's also a perception that that's counterproductive. Do you expect that in his second term, the president and his government would feel the need, the ability or need or priority to begin to open up again the civic space, civil space, and political space? Do you see that happening?
Irrespective of the scope of violations that exist or do not exist, we still need to open up our political system because we have moved on security, we've moved on economics. We need to develop also on the political side in the larger sense of things for Egyptians per se. The president has said that we should start reaping the benefits of the last 4 years in the next 4 years, and I would hope that includes a wider effort on the political aspect of it. And I say this, again, from the perspective of an Egyptian who wants Egypt, like any national of any country, to be better in the future than what it was in the past. I've lived in your country for years, and I admire some of the things that you have here, but I'm also, frankly, quite critical about some aspects of your politics. But what amazes me most is Americans are always complaining that they can do it better. I'd like to see that spirit, that I don't want Egyptians to be satisfied with what they've done. We need to do it better. And it's not criticism, it's ambition.
Indeed.
To do something more.
Inshallah. We hope the best for Egypt and for Egyptian-American relations. Ambassador Nabil Fahmy, thank you for being with us today, Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University of Cairo, former Foreign Minister of Egypt, and long-serving Egyptian ambassador to Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm happy to be here.
And thank you, our listeners, for joining us. You can always join our Facebook page for any comments or questions. Otherwise, we will see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.